seeing most. Hello, bonjour, ACSESS folks. So Martin Chenier here. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. The session is being recorded, so FYI, in case it makes you reformulate your question or comments. La session va se passer en anglais. N'hésitez surtout pas si vous préférez commenter ou poser votre question en français. En fait, ça va même me faire plaisir. So we're cameras off, I guess, unless if you've got questions and want to come on with questions, and then please, if you can mute just to avoid the funky background noises. And so we'll get started. So I started my recruitment firm and staffing industry journey 19 years ago and have been actively involved in some shape or form with ACSESS over time and ever since. I sit on federal government advisory committees on behalf of ACSESS, and for the last 6 years, I've been working directly with the public procurement folks, training, coaching, providing advisory services. So back in my agency days, I was responsible for the federal government portfolio and was exposed to the good, the bad, and the ugly. Admittedly, I made a bunch of assumptions as to how procurements were being handled internally. These last 6 years have been somewhat of an eye-opener, and I've since taken on the mandate to help reduce procurement friction for clients, procurement folks, and for suppliers. So Mary and her team at ACSESS thought that it would be timely to share a government update along with a few observations to help ACSESS members in their journey to sell professional services to the federal government. So as part of today's session, the idea was to share the latest updates that impact whoever's selling to the federal government. While we're at it, I figured I'd share a few observations along with recommendations to help improve your public procurement experience. So we'll start with recent changes from the contract security program, then an update on this new directive on the management of procurement and why it matters to suppliers. Business owners, AKA clients, are now expected to research industry. They're expected to engage with suppliers and perform market research. What does that mean to you? A lot. It's actually a game changer in my opinion. Assumptions, misconceptions, along with a few suggestions. Clients assume, suppliers assume, everyone assumes stuff, and the impact can be significant in some cases. I'll spend a few minutes on that. And then before we open up the floor, I'll share a few considerations. So quick poll to help me understand my audience. You should see it pop up on screen. What is your experience selling to the federal government? So or the first response, not great or not happening. We often wonder if it's even worth the effort. You win contracts here and there, could be better, or in all modesty, you're nailing it. Just to get a quick sense, and I'll give you guys just a few more seconds. For those of you joining us just now, thank you, merci, bienvenue. So somewhat of a split. I'll share results in a second. So 35% of you, not great, not happening. Some of you winning some here and there, could be better. And then, so a portion of you guys are actually nailing it. That's great. So feel free to chime in and comment. And if you've got some of your own best practices that you're willing to share, by all means. So this is helpful just to get a quick sense on who you guys are. So the update on security clearances and the contract security program. If you're qualified on a federal government standing offer or supply arrangement, you would have received a notice from the contract security program listing the recent changes. Government departments received a similar notice, and it included a Q&A which attempted, keyword here being attempted, to clarify these new changes. So if I may, there is a lot of energy and time that went into this change, and I honestly can't see how this is streamlining anything. It was scheduled to go live a few months ago, industry and clients were putting pressure on the contract security program to reconsider this approach entirely. It was meant, and whatever, kudos for the intent, but it was meant to be more open to new suppliers who may not have access to a ton of security cleared consultants or contractors. They do list a few exceptions, which I'll go through as well in a minute, but it is effective now. So it's effective immediately. And it was meant to remove the requirement of having a valid security clearance at bid closing. So now they're shifting that to must be valid at contract award. So this was included in the procurement officer Q&A package. So procurement officers are told to include instructions for bidders, asking them to complete what they call an application for registration form and to give them until contract award date to obtain the required clearance. Contract award date being whatever reasonable time delay I'm hoping they'll give you, but that hasn't been specified. Procurement folks will then send your completed AFR form along with a security requirement checklist and a cover sheet that lists sort of details of the solicitation number, the organization stuff. And this is being sent to the contract security program for folks. So this is what the application for registration form looks like. Nothing fancy, but just more forms to fill out. The contract security program website has instructions on how to fill this out. So they've put this up. It's open to suppliers. So instructions on what goes where and how to fill out the form. So this is if you're going through this for the first time. So maybe the client is clever. Maybe they were coached by a clever supplier and they say that they can't wait for the security clearance process. Short answer is no. If you have a relationship with the project authorities, and if they're looking for advice because they're desperately trying to get someone on board and they know about this security requirement, the advice here would be just get them to plan early and to get their requirement out to procurement as soon as possible in order to allow enough time for clearances. But it's also for translation, which is now a mandatory requirement. Everything has to be pushed out in French and English, by the way, as well. So it's just the combination of all these extra things that they're being expected to do as part of their requests when they're asking for professional services. So just if you're talking to them directly, this would be the advice, because they will be told that no, it's not an option, even if your request is urgent. Admittedly, duplications of clearances or a basic enhanced reliability clearance can take less than a week to process, but secret clearances can take up to a year. So clients lose their mind when they find out that security clearances are guilty for the delays. So if there's anything that you can do on your end to help manage client expectations, I would strongly recommend that you do. Exceptions are always interesting. The program was listing a few exceptions. If the requirement is being procured from underrepresented suppliers and or social enterprises. In other words, if your company meets the criteria for underrepresented suppliers, you'd be given the option to start your security application process before contract award. Also in cases where there's a security requirement as part of a pre-solicitation phase. So this is rarely the case for professional services, but it is listed as an exception. Or call-ups or contracts that are issued against a supply arrangement and upgrades to existing organizations' clearances are needed. So for example, this could be that there are new security requirements and your organizations need to upgrade. Maybe the work involves document safeguarding. So you could be processing your upgrade pre-solicitation in this case. So in terms of exceptions, those are it. The program did offer some service standards and claim that they can issue enhanced reliability clearances, which are the basic ones, within a week. Enhanced was rarely the issue, but many departments ask for secret clearances. So this is where they get funny. If we figure that there are 20 business days per month, they claim that they're currently issuing secret clearances within 4 months. Active suppliers will tell you that this is actually closer to 12 months. 8 to 12 months, I would say, is where it seems to be. But when I contacted the contract security program help desk directly, they even told me to expect a 6 to 12 month turnaround time for secret clearances. So to be continued to see if they'll actually reach their target date of 35 business days. So no doubt that you'll have questions if you're new to the process. They offered these support options to both the procurement and supplier community. Benefit of the doubt is cute and all, but if these service standards are out of whack, or if this process is impacting your ability to meet your client's operational outcome, industry associations, including ACSESS, are currently putting pressure on the program to revisit their process. I'm convinced that they'd love to hear from you if you want to chime in and share your 2 cents, whatever's working, whatever's not working. But if you're even trying to navigate this process, you can reach out. They have that 1-866 number or the email address, and someone will be getting in touch with you if you need additional help with security clearances. Another directive we're talking about, this one came into effect on May 13th, and I think this will be a good thing for the professional services industry as a whole. Every year, the Office of the Procurement Ombudsman shares their list of top 10 issues. You may have seen this. In 2019-20, 50% of the issues had to do with the ineffective use of evaluation criteria. For 2020-2021, it came back in the top spot. So I bring this up now because some of the updates that I'll share today, along with suggestions and recommendations, are linked to this issue directly. And with this new directive in place, there's now an opportunity for the go-getters out there to have a more significant impact on the process. So this new directive is in fact years in the making and now replaces the contracting policy. So some of you might be familiar with the way forward, procurement modernization initiatives, the role of the chief procurement officer. There's been several attempts made over the years to streamline and simplify public procurement. Industry and client departments were asking for greater flexibility, more collaboration, less risk aversion. Central agencies were asked for guidelines with less of a rigid structure, more room for interpretation. So there you have it, folks, a directive on the management of procurement with some wiggle room. Departments and agencies were expected to fully transition to this new directive by May 13th, 2022. So it's in place now, and it's relatively new. Treasury Board Secretariat listed 6 expected results as part of this directive. So the one that I believe will be of interest to you guys, to suppliers, is their first objective. So number one, procurements are managed in a manner that enables operational outcomes and demonstrates sound stewardship and best value consistent with the Government of Canada's socio-economic and environmental objectives. We were talking about the contract security program a minute ago. New directive and new process effective May 2nd. This one here is also brand new, effective May 13th, and refers to enabling operational outcomes in its first objective. So Alanis Morissette would call this ironic, I think. Makes you wonder if the right hand talks to the left hand. As I was saying, the first objective will be of interest to suppliers. Why? I keep reminding procurement teams, you don't buy best value. You don't go in the system and select a best value contracting vehicle from a drop-down menu. You obtain best value when you do your research, when your clients know what they want and know how to buy it. How will they know the best practices for buying a certain type of expertise or solution? They'll have to talk to suppliers directly and ask questions. In recent training that I gave to some of our PAC members, I was saying, if Rockstar procurement person is contacted by, super important high in the food chain director general who happens to have a critical requirement that can't wait another 3 months. So this kind of a big deal client says that every day that goes by without a contract in place impacts operational outcome. What will you recommend for those types of situations. So this was me addressing our public procurement members. How will this situation be handled now versus how you would have handled it under the old regime? So the answer is industry engagement. Procurement folks have to help their clients with market research, help them ask the right questions without compromising the integrity of the procurement process. Suppliers, you guys now have a huge opportunity when it comes to providing best practices, insights, sharing do's and don'ts, and I'll expand on that in a minute. So Treasury Board had sent this one pager to, they refer to them as senior designated officials. So the one that's ultimately accountable for procurement within the organization. So a couple things to point out here. We talked about outcome-based procurement. So this says, consider opportunities to use agile procurement principles. Don't assume that agile is meant for large multi-million-dollar contracts. Don't even assume that they have to be for highly complex IT requirements. Agile means be flexible and adjust based on industry feedback. During Q&A, procurement folks are now expected to pay closer attention to supplier feedback and to engage the market more effectively. Quote this stuff when you're sharing input and best practices. You'll want to let your clients know that your role is to help them obtain market insights, which explains your market research offer. The last thing I'll show on this directive thing is how it identifies 3 internal stakeholders and describes roles and responsibilities for each. So this was buried in the directive, so don't assume that clients know this. We, as part of our training and advisory services, we pull this up and then create it in a format that was easy to share and communicate with the members. Don't even assume that procurement folks studied this either. So for example, business owners, the term is interesting, but your clients are now expected to do market analysis. So help them to obtain supplier feedback, offer it, expect resistance in some cases. So this is a drastic change, as you can appreciate, for some organizations, for some clients, for some procurement officers, but position your marketing efforts as market research. As part of the webinars and training session that I delivered to PAC members, I spent a lot of time explaining the importance of supplier engagement, how to do it, how to ask for input, how market intel can be invaluable to the procurement process. And so there's now an expectation that you would be providing that information to them. Any questions on this stuff so far before we get into, let me take a look at chat or raised hands. We're good. So the next few slides, they summarize common assumptions, and I'll offer my 2 cents on these assumptions and misconceptions that we sometimes have. So first assumption comes from many suppliers. Maybe your sales folks were able to successfully get through to the head of whatever department or sector. They made the pitch. The client is intrigued as they could really use the external help. Well, guess what? Procurement gets suspicious when a client comes to them with a full roadmap and plan. It's unusual for clients to have a perfectly laid out, let's say, statement of work, or when evaluation criteria is perfectly put together and perfectly crafted without any internal support. There's suspicion happening. So don't assume that clients understand the procurement process, whether they know how and when to engage suppliers. Don't assume that they'll take your information and brief their procurement officer with your best practice information. And if the client found all the right words, let's say, hypothetically speaking, they found all the right words to get your message across to their procurement officer, just don't assume that they'll understand your recommendation. So now what? For starters, provide the rationale as to why this tool or this approach makes more sense given the requirement. Maybe you have an opinion as to the process that should be used for whatever it is that they're trying to obtain. If you can find samples, great. and quote the source of the sample. So for example, Transport, whatever, Canada came out with a similar requirement not too long ago. Here's why it worked. Here's why it didn't work. So maybe it's the copy of an RFP saying, look, seems to be what you guys are looking for. This is how they went about assembling this and putting this out there. I would suggest, and my best practice information as a supplier would be for you to tweak whatever M1 to read this instead, or maybe you want to make whatever changes or alterations to the point rated criteria section. So as much as some clients flat out request them from suppliers, don't assume that the effort that you'll put into creating the statement of work and evaluation criteria will be a good use of your time. You're better off sharing the information in the form of best practices would be the consideration that I would offer at this point. So speaking of strategy and being strategic in what you do, don't assume that there's been a carefully thought out sourcing strategy to buy the services. Some of the procurement officers out there are brand spanking new and are put in charge of complex multi-category, multi-million-dollar processes. Some of them barely understand TSPS or TBIPs, and the training that they get from central agencies is, let's just say, average at best. If that wasn't enough, there's also a significant shortage in the procurement field, roughly short 1,000 procurement officers at the federal government level only. Yeah. So if you're invited to an RFP process and you're wondering why it looks off, maybe they don't know. Maybe they didn't research. Maybe client came to them last minute. Maybe it's all of the above. So now what? Well, in some cases, the best that you can do is to try to fix this thing during the question and answer period. Granted, it's not ideal, and sometimes it's too late, but it may be the only thing left to do. And assume positive intent. Like if you formulate your question properly and offer a rationale as to why you're asking the question, why you're wanting to make a certain recommendation or propose a certain change, they just might reconsider their wording. So do take the time, share samples and share the whole document. Sure, there are templates, but some of these RFP templates that procurement officers are being asked to use, and they're often being recommended to start them from scratch. So they take the template, which in some cases it's 100 pages long, and then procurement folks are having to just build clauses and stuff from scratch. So they're curious to see how similar requirements were assembled by other departments. It gives them a starting point. Sure, it might not have been a piece of art, but it's certainly a starting point and can shave a few days of wait time, because it does take a significant amount of time for them to build the solicitation document, even after they have like a complete statement of work or evaluation criteria. That's usually what gets underestimated from clients, even from suppliers. So don't make that assumption. Hey boy, now there's an assumption. So clients have a budget that they need to spend. They know they'll need outside help, but don't assume that they know how to bring that requirement to life. So most clients don't know what they want, don't know how to buy it, which explains why you would see RFUs as opposed to RFPs, so request for unicorns. Actually, RFBUs in most cases request for bilingual unicorns. Similar messages before. Too often, it's the mentality of we'll aim high and hopefully this person exists. From the outside, and I often made that mistake, I just assumed that they had someone in mind already. It looked way too specific and wired. And then I would tell the team, let's just not even bother. Clearly they're having discussions with whoever, company out there, and they're just trying to tailor the requirement for this particular individual. But sadly, for a lot of these, clients are just ill-prepared and disconnected from market reality, and they don't fully understand the concept of mandatory criteria and how suppliers won't waste their time putting together a proposal if their resource will be deemed non-compliant. So I've had to explain the process and the concept of evaluation criteria to many clients who just didn't know. They figured that they'd have the option to pick the next best thing. So we'll just, put the list of everything that would be so awesome to get. And this person's going to be bilingual and have all these certifications. They're going to have a ton of experience. And then they figure that you guys would be putting together a proposal for what's going to be as close as possible to that ideal wish list. And that if they don't get everything, that they'll pick the next best thing, which doesn't happen. So what do? Do your homework, determine best practices for buying whatever type resources that you represent, and share it as best practice information. Let your clients know that you're helping them with their market research. While you're at it, do yourself and your government prospects a favor by managing their process expectations. Explain, and I know this sounds like you shouldn't have to do this, but trust me when I say this, you'll want to explain the concept of backlog, of a queue, mandatory requisition forms. They may not sort of be fully aware that they have to send a internal requisition form, and then the assigned security requirement checklist, and then they have section 32 forms and this and that. The time it takes to create 5 or 6 versions of that statement of work, explain, the time it takes for a procurement officer to dump everything in the RFP template. When some of these officers are relatively new at this sort of stretches out the process, takes a bit more time. Refrain from suggesting that it's quick or it only needs to be posted for 5 days. Many departments have like 30 to 60 day backlogs. Before they can even assign the requirement to an officer, there'd be 30 to 60 days where the request just sort of sits in the queue. So that's when reality kicks in, when clients assume that they can get this person in a couple of weeks because they're being told that, look, you only need to post this for 15 days. Well, sure, once we get to that point where we're ready to post for 15 days, it'll take 15 days, but how much time is it going to take for us to get to that starting point? So just in terms of managing expectations, they'll appreciate that they just have to plan accordingly. Procurement folks assume that clients know what they want and assume that bidders will read the requirement and understand what the client's looking for. And then they'll diligently start working on a proposal. Suppliers assume that procurement folks have done their due diligence and will coach their clients to avoid missteps. Stop, don't assume. When a process fails, too often I'll hear, we just need to invite more suppliers. No, you don't. You need to fix your RFP. You need to fix the wonky criteria, or the fact that you're asking for not 1, but 2 of these rare unicorns. Granted, it's a pain in the butt to drop what you're doing and write an email that may or may not be taken seriously, but in some cases, explaining why you don't or won't be bidding is enough to make clients reconsider their unicorn strategy. In fact, some procurement folks, they use the email to say, see, I told you suppliers would have an issue with these criteria. And I've had procurement folks back in my supplier days just say, can you please send that question in, because they don't believe me. Like they're not taking my word for it. So I think it'd be better if you were to send that in to let them know, look, no, you can't find a bilingual certified project manager that's got 16 of these IT projects under their belt that they've all completed in the last, 5 years. That doesn't exist. So you may want to take the time to send that in. No guarantees, but it just might make them reconsider their proposed strategy. So those evaluation criteria look quite specific. The client must have someone in mind. So in some cases, sure, and you would be right, maybe they do have someone in mind. But in many other cases, it's that request for unicorn strategy. Clients are just dumping their wish lists in there, hoping it sticks. When clients are asked to send in their evaluation criteria with little to no support, the resourceful ones find RFP documents and then they just pull random criteria that may or may not make sense. They may have reached out to a counterpart from this other organization, or they call someone from the previous department where they were at saying, hey, do you have a copy of the RFP that you released last year for blah, blah, blah. I need to create evaluation criteria and I don't want to have to start from a blank page. So now what? Well, state the obvious. By email, preferably, tell them that, look, what you're asking, it looks restrictive. Ask if they'd consider alternatives. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. But if that homework that you did on best practices is nearby, cut and paste it in your response and ask if they'd be open to that change. So if you recall, the new directive means more collaboration, more supplier engagement. Well, they asked for your feedback. Give it to them. Your RFP appears restrictive. We think you're limiting your options. Would you consider the following? And then park it, hope for the best, focus your efforts elsewhere, and then see what comes back. But just don't make the assumption that you can maybe try to put together some sort of a compliant bid. Just put it out there, say, this is the issue that we have with it. The last assumption that I'm wanting to share with you today is this. So my question during the Q&A was fully understood. So you're assuming that, you've asked a question, it made sense to you at the time. This doesn't make sense. Let me leverage Q&A and I'll put it out there. So Brene Brown would say, assume positive intent. Well, not all clients and procurement officers assume that bidders have a positive intent. To be fair, not all suppliers assume positive intent from government RFPs. Back in 2020, I helped the Office of the Auditor General with an audit of agile procurement. So we were looking at large, complex IT RFPs that had been issued, and I was tasked to assess the department's ability to properly handle questions during the Q&A. So anything that had to do with industry involvement, industry engagement. My role as part of the audit was to take a look at how that went. So long story short, 33% of the questions weren't properly answered as part of the assessment that we did. So they didn't address all parts of the question. They clearly misunderstood and in some cases didn't bother seeking clarification, or the response lacked rationale. No, the criteria remains unchanged, period. No explanation as to why, just sorry, thanks for the question, but it's going to stay as is. So now what? So be clear and to the point. Make sure that there's a question mark and that you're not just offering random observations. Sounds funny when it's explained that way, but I've seen more of like an observation type paragraph where there was no question mark. So it's okay to point out what's wrong, but don't expect an answer if your question isn't carefully crafted, or if it's just if there's no question mark. So be clear, get someone to reread your question, maybe just to make sure that they're fully understanding the essence of what it is that you're trying to relay. All of that being said, so figured I'd recap with several considerations, and we will be also leaving some time for questions, reactions afterwards. So first consideration would be provide market research. So maybe it means rebranding your current marketing material, and you're calling it market research. Market research is procurement friendly, it's client friendly. Strongly recommend the use of best practice pointers, but be sure to quote sources or even numbers for added credibility. I know that some suppliers, and I've talked to a number of them in the last couple of years, just asking about their own internal practices and what they do to keep tabs. And some of the folks out there, they have systems that keep track of these are all the RFPs that came out of this organization in the last X amount of years. This was the evaluation criteria that was used and stuff. So you guys are gathering intel, quote that intel, put it to good use and say, look, we've been involved in this for X amount of time, X amount of years. Here are observations. These are best practices for, let's say, requesting ATIP officers. You're going to want to consider this. You're going to want to make sure that you're not asking for university degrees, as most of them don't have them. So share that insight and put it in the form of market research. And again, under the new directive, they're now expected to do that research. So you're just doing them a favor. So I had this one colleague from my agency days who would always assume that procurement folks were put on earth to sabotage his contract opportunities. He would do anything humanly possible to try to get around procurement folks and maybe mislead clients into suggesting that it should be requested as a non-competitive contract, and you should do this and you should do that, and then don't listen to procurement. You'll be better served if you engage with procurement during all phases of the process. During the planning phase, when the client is looking for supplier insights, is an opportunity to share your input, to share whatever it is that you know about that thing that they're trying to buy, the external support that they need. During the solicitation phase, as part of Q&A, if you're involving procurement, saying, hey, thanks for inviting us as part of this. Here are observations at first glance. We noticed this. Is it safe for us to assume that this is what you're trying to achieve? What we've witnessed and seen is that normally departments do this or they do that. I noticed that you haven't done that way. When the contract is in place as well, involve procurement. Oftentimes, if there are issues maybe on your end, scope creep, clients trying to get your resources to do more than what was covered as part of the statement of work. You're sensing that there's some sort of frustration on behalf of the contractors, the consultants, the temporary help folks. Reach out to procurement. Some of them can help. They're going to want to hear your version of what's happening, what's not happening. Sure, there are some overzealous procurement folks out there. Same goes for overzealous suppliers and overzealous clients. I think you'll be better served by involving procurement versus trying to get around them. Third consideration has to do with contracting tools. Clients have to use contracting vehicles when it comes to professional services. Get to know them and get to know which ones work best for certain types of resources. Again, don't assume all clients get this type of advice from their own procurement officers, but encourage them to validate your information with their procurement officer. They'll appreciate the quick sort of high-level crash course, but make sure you studied first. Questions on this so far? All is good? Mary suggested sharing a few words on PAC, so Procurement Alliance of Canada, to see if this could be of use to ACSESS members. So like I mentioned in the intro, we've taken on the mandate to provide training material and resources to help all of those involved in the public procurement process. Our members include mainly federal government procurement officers, but also suppliers. And we're starting to onboard clients who have been asking for assistance with their statement of work and evaluation criteria. It is their responsibility to put together these documents. Most of them need help, they need guidance. And so they've been asked to check in with us to see if we can provide this support. So members who want the overview of contracting vehicles for professional services can take our Buying Professional Services e-learning course, which was updated with 2022 updates. So this is made available to all types of members, so whether they're supplier members, procurement folks, or clients. And we're not getting into the weeds, same as how, let's say, Public Works or Canada School would get into every single detail, nuances, clauses, and whatnot. We're providing a high-level summary. Here's what you need to know. Here are the key features. And it's been well received so far by all members. So via our webinar Wednesdays or directly from our platform. Our platform allows members to communicate relevant information. So for example, we recently hosted a supplier insights webinar featuring one of our supplier members, using examples and through a facilitated discussion. It was an opportunity for this supplier member to share best practices directly with our procurement members. And the feedback that I get from our procurement members is, do more of these, please. They find it quite helpful. It's practical. Why would suppliers not bid on our opportunity? And then when we get them the behind the scenes info and we're sharing supplier insights directly, they find it useful, and it helps them with their future procurement processes. Clients love one-pagers, and so we've created a number of them with the goal of having suppliers or procurement folks share these with clients directly. Maybe they're unclear as to how they can award a non-competitive contract to your company directly. Supplier members can share our pack pointer and say, here, don't take our word for it. This is what you need to know. This is the process. You can, let's say in this case, because we're already pre-qualified as a supplier under blah, blah, blah supply arrangement, if it's under a certain threshold, assuming that security requirements, this and that, it is an option. And this is why I'm saying you can deal with us directly, assuming that it meets this criteria. So this is the type of information that we're encouraging our members to put in front of their clients directly, and then say, don't take my word for it. This is actually being vetted by Procurement Alliance of Canada. But Martin, with all of this value, it must cost an arm and a leg to be a member. Well, thanks for asking. No, it doesn't. Supplier members have access to the resources, the e-learning content, webinars for a 12-month period. The per member yearly cost is $18.88. It's in everyone's best interest to have as much participation from each organization, which is why we're offering a sign up for one and get a second team member on the platform for the same price. So we currently have approximately 100 members. They range from junior procurement officers to team leaders, PG5s, PG6, directors, senior directors. We have small agencies as well as large departments, agents of parliament, Infrastructure Canada, ESDC, the Office of the Auditor General, CRA, RCMP, National Security, Intelligence Review Agency. And we recently onboarded the folks handling professional services requirements at Indigenous Services Canada, as well as Global Affairs Canada. I do my best to share supplier insights with them directly, so providing my point of view and suppliers' point of view, but I know that all of these folks would like to hear from suppliers directly. So for each ACSESS member activation, I am offering complimentary advisory services to ACSESS, to Mary and her team directly. Okay, c'est tout. That was the pitch. I hope this was helpful and useful. Let's find out. I'm going to ask you. Everyone's time is precious. I want to make sure that I made good use of your time. Was this helpful? Yes, somewhat. Maybe you're a pro at this and you already knew all of this stuff. I hope that there were at least a few good takeaways, and I was told to wrap up within 45 minutes and to leave time for questions. So on that note, thanks for tuning in. I can stick around for a bit for questions if you have any reactions, comments. Okay, great. Glad to see that. Great. Okay, so useful. Thank you. Some of you might need help selling to the federal government. It is a interesting beast, to say the least. I think even for those of you on the call that have been going at this for decades, I think that there's never a dull moment. I'm sure you would agree that you're still learning stuff every day. And I can't stress this enough. So I'm just keeping an eye on the chat. Yes. Okay. So yeah, the recording will be available to those that attended the session. I can't stress this enough. The new directive, I know it sounds kind of nerdy and whatever, kind of boring to a certain extent, because it's this other whatever policy or directive. But because they're flat out saying and that Treasury Board and the government is now recognizing that they need to do a better use of supplier feedback. They need to engage with industry. They need to understand the market, because in most cases they push out requirements and it's not necessarily aligned with market reality, that it's just asking for, well, these unicorns that I was referring to. So if anything, now more than ever, I would say you will see probably or have more and more of these opportunities to engage directly with prospects, directors, managers. And so I'll be curious to see how that plays out for you guys over the next months or years. But make reference to the fact that you're now helping them in their journey to the public procurement journey, and that you're just trying to help them do their job more effectively. So if it's positioned that way, I think that you should be able to see some successes as a result. I need to pause. I need to not talk for a bit so that we're allowing folks to ask their own questions.
Is this done, this payroll?
Yep.
Oh, it's all done. I just saw the people in yellow that for.
Well, those are the.
Hello, is this a question for me? Or is this someone not on mute? I think that's someone not on mute.
Yeah, I think it was somebody not on mute, Martin.
Any questions, any reactions? Do you see yourself applying some of this stuff as part of your day-to-day? Are you, how are your questions being handled? Are you, were you making any of these assumptions yourself? Is there anything in there that you think may help you as a practical takeaway effective now?
Oh, hi, Martin. Mike Shiger here from ACSESS. How are you?
Hey, Mike, I'm good. Thanks. How are you?
Good, good, good. You know, I think the only thing I would make a clear distinction on in selling is, you know, if you're working with client departments versus PSPC directly in their procurement tools, because some of those client departments have a lot of different rules and hoops they got to jump through when using those tools, right? And so sometimes there's got to be a mindfulness of knowing that sometimes there's a bigger brother watching over the contracting world in those client departments, right?
It's the interpretation, Mike, that some of them, and the new directive is saying that they don't want to make it like, they don't want to make it explicit saying you can do this, you can't do that. So they're intentionally leaving room for interpretation. So you know, to your point, like some of these contracting vehicles that are made available to whatever client departments and agencies, the business rules are laid out. So there's in the supply arrangement, it would say like, you know, you invite X amount of suppliers, you can do this, you can't do that, but there's still the basic business rules to be used and to be followed. The interpretation that some departments give to some of these rules is why we end up seeing some funky looking RFPs. But there's some basic guiding principles, and from these guiding principles, and I'll use non-competitive contracts, for example, like some departments or agencies, they'll have forms, they'll ask their clients to fill out the 7, let's say, questions from Treasury Board Secretariat. Like if they're if it's a non-competitive requirement, they're saying you need to fill out these 7 questions. In other cases, they're saying no, because it's under the $40,000 threshold, whatever, just send in the requirement. You don't need to fill out any forms, just as long as you're picking someone that's a qualified vendor. So if that's what you're referring to, Mike, like some departments and agencies, they have a little bit more tolerance than others when it comes to the risk. But it's you know, a lot of the message that I was wanting to share with you guys today is don't make these assumptions that that just because this one organization that you're dealing with was getting their client to do whatever, and that it's going to be the same elsewhere. So yes, it's about expecting that this one group is going to be issuing the requirement a certain way. This other group is making use of TBIPs in a way that's maybe completely different. don't assume that they understand what it is that you're trying to recommend. It's all, hence why I was wanting to position it in a don't assume type format, and these are some considerations, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, no, you're absolutely correct. It's the big piece is that assumption piece for sure. It's especially when you're dealing with the external folks not from PSBC, there's a lot of interpretations on how those vehicles can work. So you're absolutely right with that.
It's the non-PS, so the whatever client departments, but the one, so if it's like there's PSPC and then there's everyone else, right? So to your point, like if some of these smaller agencies or you know, non-PSPC departments, they're not exposed as much. Some of them have very modest operations. So if you're dealing with an organization that has whatever, like 4 or 5 procurement officers, in some cases it's like 1 or 2, and they're being expected to take on everything. So professional services, goods, whatever, like chairs, they're buying everything. Well, they're not completely up to speed with, you know, is there a departmental standing offer on this, and is there something that allows me to have access to translation services or language training? And I've heard of that, but I don't know exactly what it is, or I've never used PASS before, but I know that there's a vehicle for audit professionals. I just don't know enough about it. This is the reality of the non-PSPC. So to your point, and I think that that's part of the message is that you were sharing, is that there's the PSPC requirements that come out with procurement officers from there. And then there's everyone else that's attempting and trying their best at making full use and effective use of contracting vehicles for professional services. But the results are what they are. And it'll vary from one organization to the other based on the experience or the training that they went through. So the whole assume positive intent piece is that we often just, and I know that many of you will think, you know, I'm not going to bother with this because they've completely messed up the point rated section. At best, my resource would score whatever 60%, and they've put in a minimum pass mark at 70, so I'm not going to bother. Well, you know what? Bring it to their attention. You have a minimum pass mark, whatever, at 70%. You know, does your client fully appreciate that if they have someone that has all of the experience that they're looking for in the mandatory whatever criteria section, that someone that has X amount of projects would still not meet your minimum pass mark? Just wanting to bring this to your attention. Would you reconsider? You know, maybe would you consider lowering your minimum pass mark? I've had supplier members comment saying that they didn't realize that was an option. And some of you veteran suppliers out there, like you would know that you can ask questions, and maybe you do and maybe you don't. But some of them don't see that that's problematic. And like some clients don't pick up on that. They don't realize maybe they've been recommended that a pass mark, using the pass mark example, that's a standard, that it has to be at 70%. Well, guess what? It doesn't have to be. You don't even need a pass mark. They don't understand and they don't fully appreciate how all of that RFP document comes together. Asking for 2 or 3 resources, and then to have the resulting whatever contract be one contract issued for all of these resources. Well, maybe it's in your advantage as a supplier because you have all of these 2, 3, 4, or 5 resources. But if if you don't, and you have one rock star and then the other 4 wouldn't be great, and so you'd prefer to just have an opportunity to get the one contract, well then, you know, bring it to their attention and mention that, because that's a lot of what's going to be expected from industry. And it's always, I would say it's always been expected. It's just that there wasn't as much of an opportunity for industry to communicate and engage with clients directly, or with procurement. There was that whole kind of, you know, please don't engage with industry because God forbid that clients would. There's been a shift, and I think that that's positive. So. Matt, you'd asked, sorry to put you on the spot. You'd asked or commented early. Was that addressed as part of the session? Any follow-up question on that?
Well, I think the feedback I offer is the majority of what you've described is the proper intent of the government to go acquire new services. And that's great. And I took away that Treasury Board agile recommendation from May the 13th as a powerful way to just remind procurement officers that, you know, we're aware of these new techniques. We're holding you to account to adhere to the new Treasury Board rules. So, you know, be advised accordingly. What I think I miss here, though, is a lot of the procurement, I'm trying to pick whether it's 50% of the time, it's a renewal activity. And so they kind of jacked up the requirement to accommodate the incumbent. And to put it out as an open procurement and have industry try to figure out or parse through it to see whether there's a true opportunity there. We spend an inordinate amount of time doing that. And so I differ that from the net new requirements that I agree with you 100% the way you've described it. A little bit more nefarious on the renewal process. And I just wondered if you'd share any insight in terms of what your experience has been on that front. When truly the end client just wants to extend, but it's being portrayed as an open procurement. So how do you reconcile that?
So the comment I'd make here, Matt, is that, so a couple things. So there's some clients that truly do, and I've seen this happen. I've worked on some of these files where the client was pleased with the incumbent. It was convenient and easy to repurpose. So what had been released, whatever, 3 years ago, or whatever, maybe it's 5 because it was initial 3 plus 2 option periods. So 5, and then the 5 years is up, or the 3 years, or there's no more options. They need to go back out. So of course it's convenient and easy to just take whatever existed, put a new date on it, make minor tweaks. Essentially the statement of work looks the same, and then they go back out with it. If it was restrictive at the time, or if it took them, like if it was a struggle to even get compliant bids at the time, but they got some, and because there was an incumbent, so something worked out. So for many of these clients, it's the convenience part. It's the not knowing. It's them saying in these planning sessions when procurement and I've sat in on some of these sessions, and they're saying, look, I am open to, I'm open to make this a fully competitive requirement. Sure, you know, we had this incumbent now for X amount of years, and it worked out well. But if there's somebody else out there as a supplier that can do this just as effectively, we truly do. And you know, they'll say, like, I promise I'm open to making this competitive. It's the how to, like, it's the ineffective use of corporate criteria. Like, it's the not knowing, how do you structure the corporate criteria? What, like, does it make sense to ask for 3 projects in similar size, or at least 5 million in value or more? So you've got some perfectly viable suppliers out there that would nail it, that would do a good job at providing these resources. It's the not knowing, how do you put these together? And I say this with all due respect, procurement officers weren't trained effectively to provide that type of insight and to kind of do like a review of, well, if you're saying that it's non-negotiable for the firm to not have experience in whatever, to not have, to have resources that don't have this certification, it is not an option. To challenge us to the why, to many procurement officers, they're not necessarily fully trained. You've got some that are, a large majority of them aren't. And so that's not happening when it's time to reissue. So that's why we end up seeing RFPs that look as though all they want is just to secure the incumbent. They're not necessarily justifying, like, why are you asking for, why are you putting a corporate criteria that's so restrictive, that's other other than just to try to get the incumbent, right? So, and it creates challenges, it creates frustration stuff. So if you're not the incumbent, and if you're convinced that you're able to help whatever department with whatever IT requirements, and it's a team, whatever, it's to now say, yes, like, I'm aware of this new directive. I'm offering market research. We're often invited on these, and unfortunately, when we're seeing blah 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 happen, when they set the bar here or there, we believe that it's restrictive. These are our reasons. This is what we suggest you doing instead. It's more legwork. It's going to take maybe a little bit more of, like, it's more of a strategic angle, but I would say, for what it's worth, it's not that the client is always just looking to only deal with the incumbent, and they're not, it's just they don't know how to open it up or to change it to allow for net new and for potential bidders to bid on this thing that aren't the incumbent. In many cases, they don't know what that would take. And bidders are assuming that clients and procurement officers are going to work together to try to set the bar properly. And that exercise is what I'm noticing doesn't always happen, rarely happens.
Yeah, I agree 100% with what you said. Anything you can do, Martin, to influence that procurement community so that they recognize that the end client may need to be managed more effectively to put a more neutral RFP out onto the street, I think would go a long way.
Well, and that's why, Matt, and that's why I'm asking to have some of our supplier members, and that's why I was making reference that, well, it's the whole raison d'être for PAC, and what I've taken on these past few years is to try to create that ability to have suppliers engage with, well, clients and procurement officers directly, to share exactly that, like to share the insight and to say, like, look, this is who we are, this is what we do, and if you've got clients that are interested in this type of solution or these types of services, we would suggest that you consider whatever criteria that looks like this, as opposed to what we've seen, which is, and then providing the rationale as to what works, what doesn't. And then our audience, so our PAC members, they know that they're at the mercy of what industry has to say or their feedback, because they don't know how to make the changes or edits. So there's a lot of the training material and stuff that we get into, which is ask these clarifying questions, or, have you suggested asking the question this way to find out if the client is giving you a mandatory versus a point rated requirement. So it's the formulation, it's the process of how do you get that information to come to life? How do you get the RFP to come to life, knowing that they're going to have to put together evaluation criteria and that they don't know how? Here's what you can do as a procurement officer, but we want that information to come from suppliers directly, hence why we're onboarding and we're wanting some of our PAC members to be able to share this insight directly with them. So through forums or through webinars. We have a webinar session next week. It's actually on the effective use of Q&A, and it's to be able to get into that. Like, it's showing examples of, here's a Q&A exercise. The supplier brought it to your attention, saying, we think you're making a mistake by asking, let's say, 2 of these hard to find resources, and that it's non-negotiable that it has to be the 2. So here's why it's problematic, and here's what you need to know. So, but if the response in their case was no, it's more convenient to just have the one contract for the 2. Well, I'm sure it is. I'm sure it's super convenient. But what if you end up with one awesome person and the other one's crappy? Well, then you're no further ahead. So why don't you allow for up to 2 contracts? So the type of feedback, like the how to handle questions and answers. Again, we host like these weekly webinars where we want to be able to engage, but we're asking, and they're exclusive to PAC members, and we want some of our supplier members to be able to share this information directly with the procurement folks and the client folks.
Yeah, definitely interested in getting involved with that.
Great. Yeah, happy to chat. My email, there's also, anyways, send me an email, and there's I have a Calendly link in my emails signature block. And so just to schedule a demo, if some of you guys are interested in just a demo to see sort of how it works and what the forums and how it's structured and the resources that you'd have access to, maybe I showed a few screenshots of the platform, but if you want to have a more sort of one-on-one discussion about them, by all means, happy to do that. Any other questions? Thanks, Matt. Any other questions or comments? I noticed we're in overtime mode, so I don't want to keep you guys. It's 2:05.